As embers floated over Pennsylvania Avenue, the scale of the disaster became plain. Only a few residents moved in the streets, watching the presidential mansion burn beside the ruined Capitol. They had seen government clerks flee with armfuls of ledgers and boxes, while others left records behind in their haste. Carts creaked away toward Georgetown, piled with whatever valuables could be lifted. In the choking heat, the symbols of national authority cracked, blistered, and fell in on themselves. British soldiers, hardened by years of fighting Napoleon, treated the city as a legitimate military target. In their view, the burning answered the American assault on York, modern Toronto, 2 years earlier, when US troops had torched the legislature buildings in Upper Canada. Officers spoke of retaliation rather than wanton vandalism. Orders focused on public property, not private homes. Yet the choice of the President's house and the Capitol ensured that the attack struck directly at the young republic's political heart. Through the night, the storm front thickened above the blazing skyline. Thunder rolled as lightning forked behind the smoke, throwing the shattered windows into brief, stark relief. Wind drove sparks across the grounds, threatening nearby buildings that already stood half abandoned. Then rain began to fall, heavy enough to hiss against the flames and turn ash to black slurry. By dawn, the grand white facade had become a soaked, smouldering shell, its interior gutted, its columns scorched and streaked with soot. The August heat pressed against the city as red-coated advance parties moved cautiously along rutted roads toward the Capitol. Smoke from distant skirmishes hung in the air, mixing with the damp smell of the nearby Eastern Branch. Scouts rode ahead at a trot, questioning farmers and enslaved laborers along fence lines about American positions, listening for the faint thunder of retreating artillery. They passed freshly abandoned encampments, cold cook fires, and scattered equipment that marked the panic of Bladensburg's collapse. As the British neared the outskirts, they saw public buildings rising above scattered houses and half-finished streets, evidence of a government town that had grown faster on paper than in stone. Columns, domes, and raw brick stood exposed on the ridgeline, separated by vacant lots and muddy lanes. The few remaining American detachments withdrew rather than contest the approaches, dragging guns away from hastily dug earthworks. Doors and shutters slammed, shop fronts stood half open, with goods hastily removed or left strewn across floors. By late afternoon, infantry, marines, and sailors converged on the heart of the federal city, guided by officers who studied hastily sketched maps and landmarks rumoured in London newspapers. They marched past the silent Capitol, noted the absence of defenders, and fanned out along Pennsylvania Avenue. The presidential mansion, newly emptied and eerily still, loomed at the end of a broad, unfinished vista. British officers paused to survey its pale facade, recognizing both its symbolic weight and the vulnerability it now displayed. By the summer of 1814, the war had stretched far beyond anyone's early predictions. Militia units in the Chesapeake region drilled on dusty fields, their formations ragged and uneven beside a handful of regulars in worn blue coats. News from the Canadian frontier arrived late and confused, but one fact stood out. British columns had held firm, and American hopes of an easy conquest had dissolved into stalemate. The sense of vulnerability crept steadily south toward the Potomac and the low hills around Washington. Across the Atlantic, British officers studied maps of the American coastline under the dim light of lanterns in wardrooms and headquarters. With Napoleon confined and Europe quieter, they possessed ships, regiments, and a renewed appetite for punishment. Lists of grievances circulated in memoranda, affronts at sea, insults to British honour, and the American burning of public buildings at York. Planners selected the Chesapeake as a soft flank, rich with navigable waterways and lightly defended towns, where a sharp blow could sting both pride and diplomacy. Warships with weathered hulls and disciplined crews then pressed into the bay, their wakes curling past low marshes and tobacco fields. Black hulls anchored off small inlets as marine landing parties practiced quick marches on sandy beaches. Local residents watched sails on the horizon with a mixture of curiosity and alarm, while American scouts scribbled hurried reports about British strength and movements. In the humid air along the Chesapeake, the distant capital no longer seemed sheltered by its relative obscurity or youth. In the heat of 1814, war-weary planners in London and Halifax weighed reports from North America and saw an opportunity. The American invasion of Canada had stalled, yet the burning of Parliament buildings at York still lingered as a grievance. Dispatches described fragile U.S. finances, partisan rancor in Congress, and a thin coastal defense. Against this backdrop, the unfinished federal city on the Potomac appeared vulnerable. Washington represented ideas more than fortifications: Republican government, presidential authority, and the nation's untested resolve. Rear Admiral George Cockburn had already probed that vulnerability along the Chesapeake. His ships slipped into inlets and rivers, landing small parties that torched custom houses, warehouses, and militia depots. Plantation owners watched enslaved labourers row toward British boats, lured by promises of freedom and resettlement under the Crown. Villages and farms felt the sting of quick strikes, then heard distant guns as the squadron moved on. Each raid spread rumours of British reach and American impotence, unsettling communities far beyond the shoreline. When Major General Robert Ross landed with veterans hardened in the Peninsular War, British confidence deepened. Officers gathered over maps of the bay and the roads leading inland, tracing a route toward Washington that bypassed stronger ports like Baltimore. They discussed not supply depots or fortresses, but symbols, the Capitol, the public offices, the President's house. The march promised little strategic gain, yet immense psychological impact, a deliberate answer to York's destruction and a message intended for London, Paris, and the fractured Republic itself. Flames crawled along plaster and panelling as powder trains hissed through the corridors. Curtains flared into sheets of fire and carved door frames blackened, then split with sharp reports. Glass shattered outward under the heat, raining onto the lawn in glittering fragments. The mansion's tall interior spaces drew the fire upward, turning stairwells into chimneys. Outside, soldiers watched sparks whirl into the humid August air, while officers checked that no unsearched room remained. The heat warped hinges and buckled floors as the blaze deepened. Roof timbers, dry from summer, caught and glowed red before collapsing in roaring cascades. Smoke poured across the grounds and into nearby streets, mingling with the black column already rising from the Capitol. In the dim light, farmhouses and boarding houses on the outskirts flickered with smaller fires, kindled by raiding parties. Livestock lowed nervously in pens as distant church bells, left unattended, hung silent in their steeples. Wind carried burning embers over the city, and patrols moved among outbuildings, smashing powder stores and kindling anything that would burn. Marine barracks and the treasury crackled as their interiors surrendered to fire, spilling glowing rafters into the streets. In the mansion's shell, stone walls glowed dull orange, then oozed soot as paint and plaster burned away. By midnight, the structure stood hollowed, its windows gaping while a red glare pulsed over the Potomac and lit the countryside for miles. Flames climbed into the night as British soldiers moved methodically through the federal district, turning key government buildings into smouldering shells. Detachments advanced on the Treasury and the War Department, piling furniture, ledgers, and wooden fittings into makeshift pyres before setting them alight. Orders passed down the line singled out federal property, and patrols checked doorways and windows to distinguish official offices from private dwellings. Most homes remained dark but untouched, their occupants watching in silence as the public heart of the city burned. At the Capitol, firelight flickered through shattered windows as troops scattered papers and dragged armfuls of books into the open. The Library of Congress, with its roughly 3,000 volumes, fed the growing blaze. Bindings curled, pages blackened, and shelves collapsed in showers of sparks. Heat warped the building's interior as smoke rolled down the corridors. Across the city, separate fires merged in the humid air, casting a single vast glow that hovered over the Capitol and could be seen from distant farms and river landings. As the night deepened, the air thickened and the wind began to rise, whipping embers into spirals that chased along the streets. Thunderheads built over the city, and a sudden tempest drove sheets of rain across the burning core. Lightning split the sky, while gusts tore at weakened roofs, sending partially burned beams crashing inward. Witnesses later described a twisting column of wind carving a path through the smoke, toppling chimneys and walls. The storm drowned some of the flames, but left the Capitol strewn with wreckage and soaked ash. Smoke still drifted over Washington as people moved through streets lined with collapsed roofs and blackened frames. The president's residence rose out of the haze as a hollowed monument, its sandstone walls stained and blistered, its windows empty sockets open to the sky. Inside, floors had fallen through and charred beams jutted like ribs from the wreckage. Fragments of plaster, melted glass, and scorched furniture lay in heaps where drawing rooms and offices had once defined American power. James Madison returned to this scene after days spent among retreating troops, messengers, and scattered units trying to regroup. He rode back into a Capitol that smelled of wet ash and burned timber, then stood before the gutted executive mansion that had anchored his presidency. Nearby, his cabinet clustered in improvised meeting spaces, poring over reports and correspondence at borrowed tables. Government business continued in cramped rooms over shops and in private parlours, where clerks unpacked rescued documents and secretaries drafted orders by candlelight. In these improvised offices, arguments unfolded over the city's future. Some officials pointed north to Philadelphia and other long-settled centres, noting their deeper resources and perceived safety from invasion. Others traced maps of the Potomac and the original plans surveyed by Pierre L'Enfant and Andrew Ellicott, insisting that moving the Capitol would betray the vision associated with George Washington. The ruined presidential mansion stood at the heart of every claim, denounced as a symbol of exposure or praised as a scar that could be transformed into a monument of resilience. By 1815, scaffolding wrapped the ruined president's house as James Hoban returned to his own creation, now blackened and gutted. He walked the familiar footprint, measuring warped lintels and testing charred stone with a mason's hammer. Labourers hauled debris from the burned interior, their footsteps crunching over fallen plaster and shattered glass. Outside, carts delivered fresh sandstone blocks, stacked beside the scorched walls that still held firm beneath their blistered surfaces. Crews scrubbed smoke-stained masonry, chiseling away weakened sections and carefully keying in new stone where fire had bitten too deep. Over the porous exterior, workmen brushed on a heavy lime-based whitewash, followed by thicker coats of white paint that sealed the surface and masked the patchwork repairs. The blackened rooms within remained stark reminders of the attack, while the bright, uniform facade shone more intensely than it ever had before, catching light across the unfinished grounds. Inside, carpenters raised new joists and laid floors where embers had fallen through, while plasterers reshaped cornices and ceiling medallions patterned on European neoclassical models. Congress's appropriations funded not only replacement, but refinement. Ornaments sharpened, mouldings deepened, hardware upgraded. Upholsterers and cabinet makers worked from surviving inventories, recreating draperies, chairs and tables that had once framed presidential audiences. Each restored room signaled that the executive household and the authority it represented had endured beyond the flames. Ash and memory lingered together in the Capitol long after the flames had died. The ruined presidential mansion stood as a public embarrassment, a visible reminder that enemy troops had walked unopposed through the nation's political heart. In New England, printers pulled no punches. Columns accused James Madison of reckless adventurism and incompetence, arguing that the war had invited catastrophe. Merchants feared further disruption to Atlantic trade. In taverns and parlours, talk mixed anger, disbelief, and a quiet fear that the entire Republican experiment might be more fragile than anyone had admitted. Workers soon cleared rubble and began rebuilding the president's house, stone by salvaged stone, even as new reports arrived from the front. At Baltimore, the long night of bombardment over Fort McHenry ended with the garrison flag still flying at dawn. Francis Scott Key, who had watched from a truce vessel, put the sight into verse that spread quickly in broadsides and song sheets. The battered capital's reconstruction now unfolded alongside accounts of steadfast resistance, and conversations in city streets began to pair the burned mansion not only with humiliation, but with persistence under fire. News of Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans, coming on the heels of the Treaty of Ghent, added a final layer of meaning. Although the treaty restored pre-war boundaries and granted no new territory, many citizens interpreted the outcome as proof that the nation had stood its ground against the former imperial power. The president's house, once a symbol of vulnerability, gradually assumed a different role, a structure that had been scarred and renewed. Politicians, editors, and ordinary speakers alike began to speak of a second war of independence, and the blackened walls faded into legend as a necessary test the young republic had endured and outlasted. Within the renovated walls, visitors and inhabitants alike encountered quiet evidence of the earlier catastrophe. Charred stones lay concealed behind plaster, their blackened surfaces preserved rather than replaced. Curators arranged fragments of scorched wood, warped hardware, and smoke-damaged furnishings in careful displays, treating them as relics rather than debris. Each object pointed back to the night when flames swept through the executive mansion and turned the center of federal power into a gutted shell. As decades passed, storytellers celebrated small acts from that crisis as defining examples of civic duty. The tale of Dolly Madison saving the portrait of George Washington circulated in schoolbooks, speeches, and popular prints. Teachers described the hurried removal of documents, silver, and national symbols from the approaching fire. Politicians invoked the episode as proof that the presidency rested not only on law and elections, but on citizens willing to protect what it represented. Subsequent reconstructions and modernizations repeatedly exposed the building's hidden scars. Workers opening ceilings and tunnels uncovered burned timbers, smoke-stained masonry, and fire-buckled bricks. Engineers strengthened foundations and modernized systems, yet left the marks of 1814 acknowledged in records and behind-the-scenes tours. The Executive Mansion functioned as both workspace and emblem, its survival after destruction, reinforcing a national belief that institutions could be damaged, rebuilt, and made to carry forward an evolving republic.